thank you also for the invitation to speak this morning. And I have to note that this is the second Australian accent you have to listen to with my colleague over here. So firstly, I just reflecting on the last 20 years. First of all, obviously the situation has changed dramatically. And I know there's some challenges currently from a number of different perspectives, but I would say with a fair degree of confidence and reflection that they are much different to what they used to be. I arrived here in 1995, and I can say that we commonly use the term venture capital, but I think back in those days we could probably use the word adventure capital. The logistics of travelling around, even to meet with potential investees, was very interesting. I remember fondly Antonov 24 with the propellers, not very pleasant, the overnight train, and some terrible hotels. In fact, I even had to stay in the hospital once because the hotel was full. As far as security issues are concerned, back in those days, there was a large, very heavy, and I can say very unwelcoming environment as far as finding investors and meeting with investors, as far as security was concerned. And I do also remember back in those times approaching a potential investee through about 4 or 5 different steel doors and full body checks at each station. Clearly then, back in those days, there was a huge reliance on your local partner, and your local partner's genuine interest in your investment had a major impact on what happened next. There were also, reflecting back on those times, very difficult and interesting relationships with governments and local administrations. The tax environment was completely different, much more hostile. The tax police raids was something that happened again 20 years ago. The black and grey markets was a large part of the economy, lack of infrastructure, and we saw a lot of inefficient businesses. Also, a lack of laws to support investment. So back in those days, the stakes were high, the returns were very high, and so were the potential costs. So I think in thinking about where we are today, it's worthwhile reflecting on the fact that that was only 20 years ago, and pretty much all of the things that I've just mentioned now have been addressed dramatically in that time. And 20 years is not a long time, I have to say. Looking at what investors are talking to us about these days, obviously my colleague mentioned political risk is probably one of the biggest ones that we deal with now. And we see the effect obviously of the sanctions, but even companies and countries that don't have sanctions are applying quite a rigid approach in many cases, even when they don't need to. And I think it's primarily around the country risk. Country risk is relatively high now. The returns are obviously lower right now. And that dynamic, as far as the technical models, when you look into valuations, don't make the numbers work the right way. Having said that, valuations are coming down. I quite often have met business people who were not here in the 1990s that invested in later times, and they reminisce about the fact that they either didn't know or didn't have the courage to come to Russia back in those days and to invest because it was a missed opportunity. What I do try and get investors and potential investors to think about is, while a lot of international competitors maybe are not focused on this part of the world, it's obviously a good opportunity to be here when others are not, because eventually the smart money will come back in this direction. It has to, given the strategic significance of the Russian Federation. One other thing that I was reflecting on during the forum this week is there's a lot of discussion around the fact that on the far east of Russia there are 6 million people on the Russian side, but a more remarkable fact as it relates to the far east of Russia in particular is that within 1,000 kilometres there are more than 400 million people. And that has to be an opportunity that investors should look seriously at, particularly in light of what we see now as well, and that is around the fact that the administrations are very, very active. We've heard from the various presentations, including the one this morning, about the incentives for foreign investors to come to this part of the world. And again, reflecting 20 years ago, those things did not exist, and you have to look at the list. It's a long list of very positive attributes and very positive incentives that definitely are attractive and are worth a look. The other thing that I reflect on is the fact that there are a lot of obviously global investors looking at globally different markets. We heard a moment ago about the fact that there are different relationships and different types of investors. But I see that those that perhaps have the courage to look at the Russian value proposition vis-a-vis other markets, because there is no easy money anywhere if you look in any of the emerging markets, and I think that is also worthwhile reflecting on as well. So in summary, there are some terrific reflections and war stories from the past. Some of our potential investors looking to perhaps participate now in something that they missed in the 90s and the early 2000s. And we do see very responsive and reactive economic incentives trying to underwrite return of investment for investors and to help diversify the Russian economy. Thank you.
Спасибо большое. Господин Watt, какие будут ваши...
Mr. Watt, what are the 5 main recommendations to the foreign investors who are planning to invest into the Russian Federation currently?
Thank you for the question. What we spend a lot of time doing within my firm, and in CIS, EY, my firm has 5,000 people, half of which are in Russia. And we have all sorts of advisors and experts on everything, financial, I should say. But what we spend a lot of time on is helping potential investors develop relationships with the administrations where they would seek to invest, and trying to help facilitate some of the dialogue that we heard earlier this morning, so the administration understands what an investor is trying to do and can put the best conditions forward to make sure that the experience, first of all, is good and the investment is successful. The next thing that we spend a lot of time on is actually helping potential investors find investment opportunities. And obviously there's a lot of financial models and legal frameworks and agreements that we work with investors on how to best protect their rights in this environment, from basic understanding of the spirit of agreements, which is a very, very important part of the dialogue, in addition to what's written on the paper. They're both equally important, and we recommend to investors that they understand who their partner or their business partner is and have done the appropriate due diligence and have the appropriate framework in place. The other important aspect that we spend a lot of time on is with respect to the relationship with the tax and customs authorities. Traditionally, it has been a big area of development in the Russian Federation. And that again also comes down to the relationship with the tax authorities, more than just filing returns and sometimes appearing in some sort of arbitration in court, but it's truly to understand the people within those administrations and trying to have a proper working relationship. Obviously, we also find that there's some new areas that are starting to develop as the economies become more global. And we see a number of Russian companies also going global in this regard, not only foreign investors coming into Russia, but areas around how to secure things like intellectual property is also something that we see as a developing issue in more recent times, and it's something that investors are taking more of an active interest in these days. Thank you.
Спасибо большое.